All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Mob Museum, and thank you for being here tonight. I'm Shakayla Alvarenga, the Director of Public Programs, and it is my privilege to introduce our special guest speaker. So for a decade, the Carlino brothers, Pete and Sam, ruled Colorado's bootlegging underworld with an iron fist. From 1922 to 1931, they controlled the lucrative flow of Prohibition-era alcohol from the southern reaches of the state to the bustling streets of Denver. But their determination pitted the Carlino brothers against powerful rival families in a ruthless high-stakes turf war. Now, over 90 years later, the Carlino legacy lives on through the work of Pete Carlino's own grandson, Colorado's Carlino brothers, a bootlegging empire author, Sam Carlino. Please join us in welcoming Sam Carlino to the Mob Museum.
Thank you, Shakayla. Boy, this is amazing. I sure appreciate the opportunity and the honor of being able to present my family's history to you folks, and it's amazing the work that you guys have done here at the Mob Museum. It's very impressive, and I'm really honored to be part of this. Thank you. I just want to give you a little background on how I found out about my grandfather. He was Colorado's biggest bootlegger for 10 years, him and his brothers. And it's an amazing story, kind of stranger than fiction, as one of the newspaper articles had written about. But it's something that my dad and his brothers, they had kept secret for over 50 years. And none of my sibling or my family members or anybody knew anything about our legacy of the bootlegging, my grandfather, and all of things that he had done over 50 years before that. But I found out in 1985. I was 18 years old, and I was working at the San Jose Flea Market. I had a sausage stand out there, and I make sausage on Friday nights and sell it on the weekends. And this older gentleman came up, and he tried the sausage, and he recognized the flavor. He goes, "This reminds me of the Time Market sausage." And I said, well, this is the Time Market recipe. It was a grocery store that my dad and their brothers opened up in 1950. And he goes, well, who's your old man? He said. And I said, well, it's Sam. And he goes, oh, Mika, I know all your uncles, blah, blah. So he goes on to tell me, he went all the way back to Colorado into the days where he worked for my grandfather. So I worked for your grandfather, and I didn't know anything about my grandfather. And he says, yeah, and in fact, I remember the day he was killed. And I said, no, I'm sorry, I think you're mistaken, but my grandfather, he died of pneumonia. And he starts laughing, and he goes, pneumonia, my ass, they shot him up. He died of lead poisoning. They killed him. He was Colorado's biggest bootlegger. He owned that state. I never forget that part. He says, I own that state. And I'm like, whoa, that's absolutely amazing. And, the secret was out. 50 years later, we found out exactly what happened to my dad and his brothers growing up with their father and their uncles. And in 1932, my grandmother was basically given 24 hours notice. They were in Denver. And after my grandfather was killed in 1931, along with his brother, my grandmother was basically given 24 hours notice to leave Denver alive with the boys. So there was 6 boys. That's my grandmother there, and my dad's the second on the left. His name's Sam, and the youngest one is Pete. He's Pete Jr. But they were basically given 24 hours notice to leave, and they ended up in San Jose because my grandmother had her father, who had a grocery store there. My grandfather Pete and his brother Sam were notorious for 10 years in Colorado. They did pretty much. They definitely ruled the southern Colorado bootlegging trade, And by 1928, 29, they started moving their way up into Denver area. And that is what really changed everything for them, because then they were going in with different rivals, and it opened up a whole new door of competition. But I'm going to start back in 1887 when my grandfather was born. This is a picture of him in 1888 with a mother and my great-uncle Stefano. This is back in Sicily. Came over here in 1897. My great-grandfather Vito Carlino came here in 1888 initially. Went back to Sicily, had 2 more children, and then came back to the United States in 1897. And they moved to Colorado. By 1898, they were in Colorado. So my grandfather was 10 years old when they come to the United States. This is around 1908 here. And he had been here about 10 years. So this is when he's about 20 years old. And what's interesting about Colorado is that, we're all familiar with Prohibition in 1920, the 18th Amendment that was passed and created, made alcohol illegal to consume or produce or transport or, so it changed this country forever as far as organized crime goes. But there's a handful of states, and Colorado was one of them in 1916, that was part of the Bone Dry Act. And they basically had Prohibition 4 years ahead of the rest of the country. So in 1920, when the rest of the country went dry, Colorado and a handful of other states already had their bootleggers set up. They had a 4-year head start on these guys. So they were very experienced, and they did very well as far as getting a head start on the early days of Prohibition. So in 1922, things were really rolling for them. And there was a fellow named Pellegrino Scalia. And he was best man at my great-uncle Sam's wedding. He was godfather to my Uncle Vic. His wife was godfather to my Uncle Joe. And he was basically the boss of Pueblo. He gets murdered by the Dana family. The Danas are literally our cousins. We're all from the same region of Sicily, an Agrigento region, from the town of Lucasicula. Pellegrino Scalia was from Burgio, which is basically Henderson and Las Vegas. It was a town right next door. And when Pellegrino Scalia was killed, it created a big rift in the power structure of Pueblo. And there was the 3 brother-in-law, nephew, and father-in-law swore vengeance against the killers, and there was a mafia trial. And this fellow here, Niccolo Gentile, intervened, and he was part of a mafia trial that was back east that was going to determine the outcome of what was happening he wrote about this in his book, Vita di Capo Mafia. He helped determine the fate of these fellas that were representing Pellegrino Scalia back in Pueblo. So this book came out in 1963. It is the first tell-all mafia book. He was a boss, and he was living in Sicily at the time. He got deported in 1937, and he wrote about how he was really involved in so many of the different pivotal moments up to 1937 in this country, and he had a lot of insight. The FBI had his book translated, and I was able to read the excerpts from this, and I was able to find out about where he had initially came to Pueblo in 1916 and was very close to Pellegrino Scalia. And then in 22, when Scalia is killed, he writes about it in his book, and it shows, that Pueblo was not a force, but it did have a say in the national scope of things when it comes to mafia-run cities. So after he was killed in 1922, there was a big power shift, and the Dana brothers there was 4 Dana brothers, and there was 4 Carlino brothers. Stefano was killed in 1918 in New York. But Carlo, Carlino, and Sam and Pete were basically fighting their cousins, the Dana brothers, over control. So John Millay Sr. was killed. This is his son, John Millay Jr. They were shot at in a drive-by shooting, so that was the second death against the Carlino faction. So now my grandfather has taken over control over the Carlino, the Scalia, Pellegrino Scalia family, control of the bootlegging in that area. And John Millay Sr. is killed. And now there's been 2 of the Carlino factions that have been murdered in this war that started between the Dana brothers. And then shortly after that, in 1923, September 10th, 1923, my grandfather's younger brother, Carlo, he was the only Carlino brother that was actually born in the United States. He was born in 1899 in Pueblo, or Trinidad. And he was killed at the Baxter Bridge shootout, which was a big shootout with the Dana brothers. To this day, they still have, in Pueblo, it's called the Pueblo Ghost Walk during Halloween time. They reenact different famous murders and deaths that have occurred in the city of Pueblo, and the Baxter Bridge shootout is always one of the big things that they focus on there. So it really did have a significant impact on the community. With hundreds of bullets were shot across the Arkansas River at the Baxter Bridge, and Carlo and Dominic Ingo were killed by the Dana brothers. So basically, this war with the Dana brothers has been escalated, and the score was 3-0, against the Carlinos. They brought in a cousin named Pete Carlino. He was the other Pete Carlino, but he changed his name to Rudy Constantino after he was wanted for murder. So it's a lot easier in my book when you're reading about Rudy that he is a Pete Carlino, but he's my grandfather Pete Carlino's first cousin. And so don't want to confuse him with, that's why we call him Rudy. That's my dad. At the wedding, he was the ring bearer, and my cousin Josie as well. So Rudy became part of the crew, and they were fighting the Dana brothers for control. And the 4 Dana brothers in 1926, Pete and Tony Dana were killed. So we almost even the score is 3-2. By the time this war ends in 1928, there's 12 dead in this war. It's basically like the Hatfields and McCoys. And right around 1928 is the time that my grandfather moves the family up to Denver. They had basically won the Pueblo war, and they decided he felt very confident that he could do well enough to invade the Denver territories. My dad told me that at the time they owned a Duesenberg. 1928, they owned a Duesenberg. A Duesenberg car was a $5,000 car back then. A house was $5,000 back then, a nice house. So it was crazy that he was driving a Duesenberg in 1928. Kind of shows how well they were doing. My grandmother, my great aunts, they all had fur coats and jewelry, and so things were going good in 1928. In 1930, a Prohibition agent named Dale Kearney is killed in July 1930. U.S. Attorney Ralph Carr realized that this has gone too far. We need to do something. They suspected that the Carlinos were responsible for it, so they brought in undercover agent Lawrence Baldessari in to infiltrate our family. He posed as a boxing promoter, and which he had done in the past. He was out of Chicago. He was Italian. He had some connections back in Kansas City, so all of his bona fides checked out when they looked him up. Of course, they're not just going to bring this guy in. And he was introduced down in Trinidad by John Caw. John Caw was one of our lieutenants that worked in the southernmost part of the state. And Lawrence Baldessari was basically the first Donnie Brasco. If you've seen Donnie Brasco, the movie, it's Joe Pistone infiltrated the Bonanno family in '76 and helped bring them down. He had a lot of convictions for them. Well, Lawrence Baldessari did this 45 years earlier. He put his life on the line every day, being an undercover federal agent, reporting all the doings back to the U.S. Attorney. So here is 1929. There was a bootleggers convention. My grandfather was instrumental in trying to organize the bootleggers to where they could fix the prices of the moonshine. On the homemade moonshine, they were being undercut. So he really wanted to get a price fix on it. Now there's some very, very interesting people in this photograph. My cousin Susan was nice enough to share it to us. But Ignacio Vaccaro, the fellow that's on the top right, at his wedding, Angelo Caruso was his best man. Now, Angelo Caruso was Salvatore Maranzano's underboss. That's the one that Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky had killed in 1931. And then he ended up becoming head of the family a short time before it becomes the Bonanno family. So another tie to Maranzano with my grandfather is Paul Dana, the fellow in the middle with the fedora. He lived at Maranzano's brother's house at 93 Truxtun Street in Brooklyn. John Caw, there he's got his arm around my grandfather, and he's the one that brought in Lawrence Baldessari, the undercover agent that infiltrated the family. Now, standing next to my grandfather is Joe Roma, and Joe Roma is a real pivotal person involved with he actually was a partner in the Denver bootlegging aspect that was going on around 1930. But by 31, Pete kind of cut him out and undercut him, and they became rivals. So they went from being friends to rivals, and it would not play well for my grandfather. On the right-hand side of the picture, you're going to see Raphael Smaldone. Now, Ralph Smaldone was the patriarch, the father of the Smaldone family. If you're familiar with the Denver crime family, then that was in power from the 30s all the way to the early 90s, this is the patriarch. Those two young boys you see in that picture, these are family photos of mine. They end up becoming the mob bosses of the Denver area in the 50s and 60s. And here's another picture of with the young boy, Ralph Jr., the old man, Raphael, our cousin, Joe Petrolia. He'll be coming into play a little bit later. He was a little disgruntled because he was supposed to be Sam's bodyguard, Sam Carlino, the underboss, my grandfather's brother. And he was undercut by Lawrence Baldessari. My grandfather decided to choose Baldessari as the bodyguard instead of having Joe Petrolia, our cousin who had come in from Los Angeles. He was originally from Tampa, but it was a move that my grandfather made that would end up being it would change the fate of everybody. Let's put it that way. He was a disgruntled family member. So in 1931, January of 31, my grandfather puts together another bootleggers convention. Well, this time Joe Roma, who was at the last one where you saw that picture, this time he did not show up. Now, I incorrectly put in my book, I want to make a note of it, that the undercover agent was the one that actually informed the police of the bootleggers convention. But it was actually Joe Roma that did that. It was not the undercover agent. The undercover agent was reporting things back to Ralph Carr, the U.S. attorney. And in turn, the U.S. attorney was reporting to the mayor of Denver, Ben Stapleton, and the police chief, Diamond Dick Reed. And they called him Diamond Dick Reed because he had a giant diamond ring and drove a Packard car on a police chief's salary. So those both were on the take. The police chief and the mayor were both very corrupt guys. They end up naming the airport after Stapleton. So if you're from or know about the Denver area, it was Stapleton Airport for all the way up into the early 90s. There's even a neighborhood named the Stapleton neighborhood that they're trying to change right now because of his Ku Klux Klan affiliation. So this wasn't a good guy, and he was really on the take, and we'll talk about him a little bit later about his indiscretions. Right about the time, just before March 17th, my grandfather was shot at, and he survived an assassination attempt, and he had the undercover agent, Lawrence Baldessari, take him to Omaha, and he was going to head back east, and he was basically going to plea to Maranzano back in New York to get the okay to take out Joe Roma. You can't just take out another member without the okay. And on his way out to Omaha, when they got to Omaha, Lawrence Baldessari drove him, the undercover agent, dropped him off. He informed the authorities. They tracked my grandfather to Chicago, to Milwaukee, all the way to Brooklyn. So every move that he was making, they were following him. This is all verified because there's an interview with a lady named Lucille Kruppe in Milwaukee, where she is interviewed by the police in late May, early June of 31, and she talks about meeting my grandfather. And I found this information in a book from Gavin Schmidt, who's from Milwaukee. And it was interesting to see how he had made his move all the way. It had been tracked from the law enforcement, but it was also backed up by this testimony from this witness, Lucille Kruppe. So Pete is running out of money. They're paying off judges. Judge White was on the take. We had Ben Stapleton, the mayor, the police chief, and they were running out of funds. So he come up with a plan. He had a double insurance policy on his house. Lawrence Baldessari, the undercover agent, was present at the time of them planning to bomb his own house. So he tried to make it look as if rivals had blown up the house. Now here's a picture of my dad and his brothers and my grandfather. He was sitting on the stoop. My father is the one on the far left. So that is the house in 1930. And this is the house after it was blown up. So for a day, the newspapers reported that it was rivals that had done it. But the interesting thing is, Lawrence Baldessari had told Ralph Carr, the U.S. attorney, who had in turn told the police chief and the mayor that the bombing was about to happen, told him the date and everything. He did nothing. They let it happen. So here's another picture of the house. So if you go down Federal Boulevard in Denver, which I've done several times, I come to this. Now it's a duplex made out of brick, but those two houses on the side are still there. And my dad told me the Leonettis on the right-hand side, he used to play with the little kids, and the windows were blown out. But the bomber, Chris McCurry, who was part of our crew, assured my grandfather that the other houses wouldn't be damaged. And the roof basically blew straight up and came right back down. This guy was a professional arsonist. And so they end up getting caught because they had the undercover agent was privy to all the inside information when they were talking about the planning of the house. So 3 of the Carlino faction members are arrested. My grandfather's back east, so he's nowhere to be found. So can't really pin it on him. And in the meantime, in April, Joe Roma actually puts a hit out on Lawrence Baldessari. Now, Lawrence Baldessari was going to pick up Sam. He was Sam's bodyguard. And he was on the way to pick him up for a court date, and he was shot outside the Mayflower Hotel in Denver. And he recognized the car that shot at him, and he recognized one of the shooters. One of the shooters was Bruno Moro, a 17-year-old kid that was one of our still runners, and that had turned and gone to the Joe Roma faction, our chief rival. And Sam was supposed to go to court that day. Baldessari never picked him up. He said he was sick, he couldn't make it to court. And then shortly after that, Joe Roma ended up having Sam killed. So this fellow Bruno Moro that was working for him, for us, and he had recruited this fella, it all stemmed from Bruno Moro not getting paid for taking the rap of they found a still, and he didn't end up getting the $200 he was supposed to get for taking the rap on when they got busted. So he went to the Joe Roma faction, and he came to Sam's house, and in a friendly manner, just like they do in the mafia, it's you never see him coming. And it was a friendly exchange, and they shot him and our cousin Jim Coletti. Jim Coletti got shot in the stomach, and Sam was shot in the back, and the bullet went through his heart. This is a picture of Sam that was in the Denver Post, and I actually own this picture. I bought it off of eBay in 2009 for $12. And I have the original photograph that was used in the newspapers. And Bruno Moro fled, and when he took off, this is the route that he took. These are police photographs, and there was a car waiting for him across the street. Now there's a house at that location. I've been down the street as well in Denver. There's a house in that empty lot now, but there was a car waiting for him, and he took off, and Bruno Moro went into hiding. My Aunt Josie, which was Sam's wife, and there's my Aunt Pat with her, and daughter Charlotte, my cousin Charlotte, they're being escorted away right after Sam is killed. She's quite distressed, and that's a police detective that's escorting him out of the house. You can see the looks on their face that it was quite traumatizing, especially having a 3-year-old daughter in the house, and they're all inside the house at the time of the murder. And she was there, and she saw that Bruno Moro was there at the house during the time. And she blurted out that to the police that Bruno Moro was the one that actually did the shooting. So the police came up to her, and they wanted to question her more about it. And she realized that she made a big mistake, because you're not supposed to ever say who did it. That put her at risk, her and her family at risk, because they catch Bruno Moro goes back, and it's tied to Joe Roma. So Joe Roma could have her and her family killed. So that's, at this point now, this is March of 1931, and she's getting her affairs in order by the end of the summer. She's going to be moving to San Diego and getting out of the Denver area because she's fearing for her life. So just about the time that Sam is murdered, they find this car, which is an old Model T, that Bruno Moro was with the passenger in when the undercover agent was shot at. He described this car, and when they found it, they had not taken the license plate number off, and it was sold through Joe Roma's used car dealer lot, and it was sold to a guy named Frank Spacito, and that was Bruno Moro's alias. When he get caught bootlegging, he always give an alias. So this is the car that was used, that was shot at the undercover agent, and that's the fellow, the 17-year-old kid that shot Sam Carlino in the back at his home. So during this time, word gets back to my grandfather, and he's, like I said, on his way back to New York. He's basically pleading his case to have Roma killed. Maranzano sends investigators, people back out to Denver to look into it, to find out if my grandfather's case warrants, what he's asking. In the meantime, my grandfather is trying to recruit people in the Midwest to go back and kill Roma. And that was a big no-no. That's not what Maranzano was looking for. They realized they were just on the verge of getting the commission formed in 1931, and they did not want to have these wars going on. It was bad for business. It was bad in the newspapers. It brought the heat down on them. So this is something that was a big no-no, my grandfather was doing. So this did not bid well for him in his trying to be able to get Roma killed. So this is a picture of my grandfather, Pete. He is on his way back, like I said, to meet Maranzano. He's told to stay put in Brooklyn until they find out what happens. Well, they actually rule against my grandfather, and they say you're going to be stripped of your power. You're still going to play a minor part, but you're no longer going to be the boss. And Roma is going to accept you back, and you're going to have a truce with Roma. What ties my grandfather to Maranzano is this gentleman here. He's our cousin, Ignacio Vaccaro. And Ignacio Vaccaro was my grandfather's bodyguard. And at his wedding, and that's my Aunt Pat there, ends up marrying my Uncle Charlie after Ignacio Vaccaro was killed. The best man at Ignacio Vaccaro's wedding is Angelo Caruso. Now, Angelo Caruso was the underboss to Salvatore Maranzano. When Maranzano's killed, he's the boss for a very short time until Joe Bonanno takes over, and the Maranzano family becomes the Bonanno family, and one of the 5 families in the commissions formed in New York. Angelo Caruso was very close to our cousin Jim Coletti in Pueblo. Remained close with him until his death. And this is the tie, one of the major ties, besides one of another fellow named Paul Dana, that ties my grandfather to Maranzano. So my grandfather finds out that he's been stripped of his power, and he is told that he's going to have to, go back to Denver and pretty much live a neutered life. He's not going to have the same kind of power that he had before, and this is something that he ends up making the mistake of not listening to what he was told to do, and he starts trying to regroup and recruit, and was basically trying to undermine the decision that was made back in New York to have Roma killed. Now, when he comes back, Joe Roma had been instructed by Maranzano to befriend Sam again. Okay, bury the hatchet. So when he comes back, my grandfather's arrested. Joe Roma is the one that bails him out. So here's a picture of the two of them signing the release for bond. And here's the bond for $5,000. Joe Roma is one of the signees, Joe Cefalù, Carmelo Calavieri. They're all friends of the family. And it was interesting to find out from my dad. He said after my grandfather was killed and our family came out to California, it took them till about 1937 and 1938 to pay these people back. They wanted to make sure that their father's debt was paid, that they gave them the money back that had been borrowed over the years, or in the past year after my grandfather eventually ends up getting killed. September 10th, 1931 is a very big day in the history of the mafia. It is the day that Salvatore Maranzano's killed, and 3 of his lieutenants are killed as well back in New York. Joe Valachi wrote in his book in 1964, came out, that there was a purge day, that on September 10th, 1931, there was 40 mob bosses killed across the country. And this was taken as the gospel for many years, and then it was actually started to become embellished, where that 40 went to 60, and then soon went to 80, and then pretty soon it was 90. 90 mob bosses were killed across the country in one day. Well, Umbert Nelli, he was a professor in Kentucky of history, wanted to find out the truth behind this, and he wrote a book in 1976 that disputed this claim. There was actually only 4 murders that occurred on September 10th, 1931. One was my grandfather's, and Salvatore Maranzano, and then the other 3 lieutenants back in New York. So to coordinate a killing of 40 people in that era, it was unheard of, but people believed it because it was, Joe Valachi had told him it was true, but it wasn't true. There was only a total of 5 murders that occurred on that day. So basically, 1931, my grandfather, or September 10th, 1931, my grandfather's killed. He is hijacked on the road, and I told you about this Joe Petrolia fella earlier. Joe Petrolia was one of our cousins. He is the gentleman that was disgruntled because he was supposed to be Sam's bodyguard, and the undercover agent ends up becoming the bodyguard. So he was actually one of the fellows that was arrested for the bombing of the house. So he's been convicted. By the beginning of September, he's in jail in Cannon City in southern Colorado, outside Pueblo. And my grandfather has set up a meeting to go visit him in prison. Well, Joe Petrolia sends word to Joe Roma that my grandfather is on his way to go visit him. So they knew exactly what road that he was going to be taking. There was 3 cars that were involved. They have witnesses that said that they'd seen my grandfather in back of this car. It was a 3-car caravan. 1 car in the front, 1 in the back. My grandfather had been captured, and they brought him out onto Salem Road, and they executed him. They shot him twice in the back and once in the back of the head. They put him underneath a bridge, and they left him there for 2 days, and nobody discovered that he was there. It was a very lonely road. Salem Road is just in the middle of nowhere outside of Pueblo. It's about 15 miles west of Pueblo, east of Pueblo. And they went back at night, and they moved the body, and then they called the coroner, and they called my grandmother up in Denver, and they said, you can find Pete on this road. So the coroner immediately went out there. My grandmother was not going to be leaving Denver to go down to Pueblo too. She was afraid for her life and the lives of her children, my dad and my uncles. So she stayed in Denver, and the coroner identified my grandfather. They had all the fingerprints, his ring, identification, and it was interesting that when I was growing up, my dad would always show me the picture of Joe Petrolia, and he says, this is the guy that set my grandfather up. So right about that time, after my grandfather's killed, my older uncle Joe, he ended up becoming a semi-professional boxer in California with my Uncle Chuck as well. But they were doing bare-knuckle brawls to make money. My Uncle Vic would be the bookie, and they were basically going on the street, bare-knuckle brawls, to make money because they had nothing. My dad would be selling newspapers at 7 years old on the streets, and so he told me he would even have to fight over a street corner sometimes with another 7 or 8 year old kid. So their life of having the Duesenberg and the big house and the fur coats and everything, that was fleeting. They were now desolate, they were poor, they were living in the slums of North Denver, and times had really, really changed for them. my grandmother was actually arrested because she would not testify against Bruno Moro, who had killed Sam, because she was at the house just before the murder occurred. My Aunt Josie was actually in San Diego at the time. My Aunt Josie went to San Diego, and she is actually the first person ever to be extradited by governor's orders from California to Colorado. She was escorted by 2 police officers by train, and she initially agreed to testify against Bruno Moro, but an attorney was provided on her behalf. Well, little did she know that Joe Roma had paid for this attorney, and she didn't know who this guy was, and he shows up in jail and he talks to her. He basically explains what's going to happen if she testifies against Bruno Moro. So she has a little change of heart. She goes to the cemetery. She visits her late husband because she's and it's funny because she was in San Diego at the time, and I was talking to my cousin Carrie, and she didn't even know that her mother had been extradited and arrested in San Diego and brought back to California. So she went back there, and she was given an opportunity to testify, and she testified just enough to satisfy the prosecution and just enough to satisfy the mafia, Joe Roma's faction. Bruno Moro was let off the hook. They didn't have Jimmy Coletti, who was shot. He disappeared. So basically, at this point, this is 1932. My grandmother is given 24 hours notice to leave. I start the book off in the first chapter. It's called 24 Hours Notice. And this is my dad and his brothers, a few of his brothers. This is actually in California once they arrived. So this is around 1933 or 34. But that was the Dodge Senior that they traveled in, that they escaped to California in. And this is a picture of my grandmother and all my dad and his brothers. So they escaped. She died in 1935 of stomach cancer, and my dad and his brothers basically raised themselves during the Depression, which is an amazing feat. So when I started to think about how I was going to write the book and why I was going to write the book, it was more of a testament to my uncles and my dad for the 180-degree turn that they had taken from the path that they were on. They were going to definitely be involved in this business. My uncles were already driving the sugar beet trucks that were bringing the sugar beets to the stills, and they were distilling, making moonshine out of sugar beets. And that was something that I saw, that, like my dad said, that the best thing that had ever happened to him, basically, was, and him and his brothers, was my grandfather being killed, because they would have ended up either killed themselves or incarcerated later on. They would have been in this life by no fault of their own. This is what their father was leading them into. And for 50 years, they kept this a secret, which is the most amazing thing to me. They kept it quiet. They were embarrassed. They were ashamed by what had happened. And that, in addition to a lot of the misinformation that I had seen that was written about the story of my grandfather and my uncle, I just wanted to write the book that was definitive story on it. I had the backstories. I had the photographs. I had a lot of insight that nobody else had. And I read somewhere that one fellow wrote that my grandfather faked his murder and moved back to Sicily. It's like, no, that didn't happen. Another one was Sam Carlino was killed. They chopped his head off. They put his head on a stake on the end of a bridge to ward off other gangs. And it's like, no, there's pictures in the newspaper. He was killed in his kitchen. that kind of stuff was getting me infuriated. So I've said, I'm going to write something that's going to explain this, good, bad, or indifferent. My grandfather was not a good guy. He really wasn't. And he'd done a lot of wrong. But things end up turning well for my dad, my brothers, even my Aunt Josie. So this is myself, my Aunt Josie, when I was a little baby. And it's interesting that her sister was the widows of the Dana brothers I told you about earlier. We were connected not only through marriage, but we were blood related back to Sicily. And the Danas and the Carlinos were so close once the husbands were dead. The women and all their kids got along great. They do Christmas, they do Thanksgivings together, and it was never spoken of again down in San Diego about what had happened to their fathers. And it was a secret that they kept, the women kept as well. And it was interesting, in 1986, I went to a family reunion, and the Sam Carlinos moved to San Diego, and the Pete Carlinos, my dad's family, we moved to San Jose. And so we were down in San Diego for the family reunion, and I was 18 years old at the time, and I was privy to sit at the table with the men, and I was listening to all these stories. And this is just after I had found out from the old guy at the sausage stand. So the cat was out of the bag. They were talking about it openly. And as soon as any of the women would approach the table, they would stop talking about it, and they'd change the subject. And then the women would leave. They'd start up. It was their way, I guess, of protecting them by keeping them in the dark. But it was really interesting to see that how that dichotomy of that was amazing to see how they were protecting them in their eyes. But it turned out okay, except for me. I started life at debauchery in 1970, and I've been going downhill ever since. But it's truly been an honor to speak with you guys today, tell my family's story. New items are constantly coming up. The longer this book's been out, it's been out almost 5 years now. And it's amazing all the information that's just coming out of the woodwork. And I hopefully I can come back again and share some new information with you in the future. And I would at this time would like to see if you guys have any questions. I'd love to answer them for you if you have any questions. Yes, sir.
What side were the small dones on? Were they towards the end?
Okay, so the small dones were actually the lieutenants for Joe Roma. And I really didn't get into the details on small dones and Roma, but the small dones had Roma killed in 1933. And they were last seen at his house by his wife, Nettie, and she went to go make sauce down the street around the corner with her mother. And she left two of the small dones and another small done lieutenant with them, with her husband, when she left. When she came back home, she found him dead with 7 bullet holes. They said initially he was shot 14 times, but they shot him with .45 caliber. The guy weighed 98 pounds. He was like 5'1", and the bullets actually went through him. So the 7 holes made 14 holes. The small dones took the reins of power from that point on. But they never really were recognized within the commission as they were never made guys. They were never went through the initiation. They weren't like my cousin Jim Coletti down in Pueblo, or Charlie Blanda down there. Those guys were real made guys. They were part of the commission, not the commission, but they were part of the structure. My cousin Jim Coletti was caught at Apple Lake in New York, November 14th, 1957, at Joe Barbera's house, along with Joe Bonanno and Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino and all the rest of the Russell Buffalino, all the guys across the country. So Pueblo was represented for Colorado within the mafia, but the Small Dones ran the Denver area, and they did mostly loan sharking and gambling. Yes, ma'am.
So, did,
I can't give you the sausage recipe, but I do have Aunt Josie's spaghetti sauce recipe. It's in the back of the book. I can't give you the sausage recipe. That's too valuable. That's going. My kids will get that. But we do make it at my restaurant in San Jose. I own Sam's Barbecue, and you can buy it if you are ever in town. We sell it raw, and we also sell it cooked there. But it's so symbolic because it's the reason why I found out about this entire just saga was over a piece of Italian sausage that some older gentleman tried. I think that's pretty amazing. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You said that this was a big family secret that nobody talked about. How did the family react when you told them you were writing a book, and then when the book came out?
Well, in 1985 was when the secret was revealed. So we did really have a good long period of time till I started researching the book in 2008, 2009, and I researched it for 10 years. And then 2019 is when I made my book contract. But the reaction to my family was positive. And that was reassuring to me. I didn't want to step on anybody's toes. I didn't want anybody to be hurt by the book. I wanted to be truthful. But what worried me more about my family, it was about me going back to Pueblo on the book tour and seeing their reaction. And when I showed up in Pueblo at the Pueblo Library, and I was interviewed by the newspaper and did a lot of events down there, book signings, I received nothing but warmth and love, and I got to tell you, it was amazing. It was completely opposite of literally family members that our family had killed were embracing the story, and I was dumbfounded by it. I said, "This is amazing, to have these family members not hold a grudge over something. It happened 100 years ago, but for the most part, those are still fresh in a lot of people's minds." So the reaction overall was pretty good. Thank you.
we will be holding a book signing with Sam Carlino right in the courtroom waiting area. And again, thank you all for coming, and another round of applause for
Thank
Sam
you.
Carlino.
Thank you, Shaquilla.